So today's going to be kind of an interesting lesson. We're going to be covering the firsts of World War I, a lot of it being kind of from trench warfare. So really, we're going to be covering some trench warfare and those technological advances, those firsts that came from it. So obviously do now, so find your assigned seating. If you're joining me online from home, you obviously are already ready to go, so just don't worry about that. But have your notes ready. Either we'll have an assigned activity sheet, but if you really don't want to do that, you can obviously do your freehand notes if that's more comfortable for you. So a general overview. So we've talked a lot about World War I up to now. We've talked about the countries, the politics, a lot of these sort of like interesting aspects that have gotten us to this point. We're now at the Western Front, which is like kind of where trench warfare really takes place. We've talked a little bit about trench warfare in the past, but right now we're going to kind of do a brief summary of what we've been talking about. I'll show you a couple of videos and clips, and then we'll kind of proceed on from there, and we'll get into like the nitty-gritty invention sort of aspect of things. So think for a minute real quick about something you see people use every day. And think about how you or they travel, think about what they will do now compared to what people did back then. So think about 1914 and 1918 to now. And then quickly just jot down in the pair deck below just anything that you know or think you know that was the first of its kind around that time period. Just ballpark guess. I mean, there's no wrong answers. Obviously, we'll get into what the real things are, but if you have an idea, just, go ahead and just answer down below. So what did you guys write? I imagine a lot of people may know one or two things. A lot of people might say, oh, there was chemical gas. Oh, there was flamethrowers or machine guns. I mean, there's a lot of right answers here. I mean, World War I just really opened up so much interesting stuff, and there's a lot of advancements in technology, strategies, warfare. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could have said, and I guarantee a lot of you have covered the idea. So let's just quickly go over trench warfare again. Like we said before in our previous classes, trench warfare was first used. It was practically really only used in World War I, and we'll actually talk about an invention today that really kind of saw the downfall of trench warfare, or an invention that really didn't make trench warfare necessary anymore. Both sides, the Germans and the Allied powers, they used trenches in a place known as the Western Front, which took place in Belgium and mainly France. This would be the main site where these new technological advances were put to the test and kind of revealed to the world. Real quick, below there is a audio clip. There's actually a video called Life in the Trenches. So it's about 3 minutes. Take a look at that, and it kind of gives you an idea of soldiers living in those trenches around that time, just to give you a little bit more context. So what did you guys think? Trench warfare put both sides in a gridlock, forcing each side to get creative and find new, inventive ways to advance and gain territory on the side. That's why these inventions kind of came into place, is because these different sides, they needed to get ground. They needed to advance on one another. These trenches, they were stuck there. It was awful. And so they needed to find ways to move. And so trench warfare very well may be the real reason that some of these inventions that you guys may have written down earlier exist today. So comment down below in the pair deck what you thought of the video, what you got from it, and just anything that you want us to comment about. So this is kind of the big one, and I want to start off with the big one because a lot of people, I imagine, talked about this one, and that's chemical warfare. For those of you who don't know, a Jewish scientist living in Poland at the time, he invented a powerful chlorine gas. Actually, later on, fun fact, this gas would be modified to be Zyklon B, which was used in the Holocaust. But back to World War I, this gas was used by the Germans. It was first aired off into the, they opened up canisters, wafted it down at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium, and later on the Germans found a clever way to put it in grenade canisters that they had launched through artillery. In this PowerPoint, you'll see some audio clips. Feel free to click on them. You get some actual real soldier audio clips of people who experience Zyklon B. It's a little dark, so keep that in mind. But I mean, this was a really crazy idea, and this was something that was, this is a whole new warfare that spawned just from trench warfare. And then lastly, I want you to kind of think, like, are there moral implications of chemical warfare? Just think about that for a minute. Obviously, jot it down if you want, but just think about that, because that's a really important question. So obviously, we're going to get into, the weapons. A lot of the dudes in the class, they probably are really into this stuff, the weapons. On the left, you'll see the flamethrower. A lot of people associate flamethrowers with zombie movies, with World War II. It's really, really popular in World War II, but it actually started in World War I by the Germans. A lot of stuff that we're going to be talking about today were invented by the Germans, especially weapons. The gas was the Germans. These two weapons I'm going to talk about are also the Germans. So the flamethrower was used to flush soldiers out of trenches. I mean, you're spewing fire, very deadly, but obviously there were a lot of risks to holding a flamethrower. Obviously, you've got a giant gas tank on your back. It's very, I mean, the range is not great, but still, this was huge. And I mean, this is something that is still not used often in like modern warfare, but they were used for a long time. On the right is something that is still very much in use. That's the machine gun. Obviously, the picture, it's a lot bigger and it's being operated by two men. These days, you'll see machine guns that are one-handed, that are basically things that soldiers can carry around very easily. These were basically known as turrets or ballistas. They were large, they were heavy to operate, but they were one of the main factors that kept Allied forces from advancing on German property because, I mean, you just couldn't get past these things. These were deadly, these were destructive, and they were very easy to set up in the ways the Germans designed them. Then we got the vehicles. So on the left, you'll see the plane. And obviously, the plane wasn't invented for World War I. It was obviously being worked on by the Wright brothers years prior, but the first warfare-type planes were used in World War I. They were actually introduced around 1916, so about 2 years into the war. They weren't actually terribly accurate. A lot of planes ended up just fighting other planes. They didn't do many dive runs or dive bombs. So they weren't really used often for fighting soldiers on the ground. They were mainly used for fighting other planes. But on the right, though, is basically the trench killer. This is the first model of what you guys know as a tank. These things were armored, they were slow, but they took a lot of damage. And basically, they could just move over trenches, any terrain. They didn't have to worry about the barbed wires, the craters. These things could get from one place to the other, and there wasn't a lot you could do. And so these things really turned the tide on the war because you could just maneuver through trenches without any problem at all. And there are guns located all around this thing, so this thing can protect itself from almost every angle, which is crazy considering the time frame this is in. So now that you've seen all of these weapons, all of these inventions, I want you to kind of think of like being a soldier in the trenches of World War I. Like, what would you be doing? Like, where do you think you'd be assigned? Like, how would you even feel about that? Like, would you feel frightened? Like, does anyone know what's going on? Do you know what's going on? Does knowing what you know now, all these inventions, all these things that people experienced, the chlorine gas especially, that's a big one, does that make you feel any differently about that? So, write a comment down, write how you feel, talk about things that you understand, like talk about maybe like how you'd feel going in if you were just like completely blind to all this, or think about what you know now going in. Like, what if you knew all of this stuff would be used? So let's do a little bit of a summary just to catch up. So obviously trench warfare is its own warfare, and it's so popular because it was a one-time use. I mean, there's very few times it was used in World War II because so many other like inventions, such as the tank, were just completely making it obsolete. But the crazy thing, and obviously a lot of World War I imagery, is the gas mask. That's another invention, obviously. There's so much that's being spawned from this. And a lot of it is because trench warfare, just so many Germans and so many people were just, they needed to get creative. And so, I mean, this is something they did. And world wars spawn creation. And speaking of that, how do wartime inventions kind of change the dynamic of battlefield? This is something to walk away with. Just obviously write it down. This is like your closing task. Just kind of, answer what you think. And do they affect everyone? Like, do civilians have to deal with this stuff? What kind of soldiers had to deal with it? Like, just, comment what you think. And then obviously, again, what are some varying ways that these creations could have been used, and talk about how they're used today. Like, talk about obviously the gap in time. I mean, it's been over 100 years since then. So really just in the comments, just go crazy. Just talk about what you really think is being discussed with this stuff. All right, have a good one.